Hello, my name's Tamika, and you're listening to A Walk in the Park with Animal Friends. So we're back today with the Tree Council. We have Phil and Annie, and the lovely little Mint is joining us as well. Hi. So if we just start, Phil and Annie, if you could tell us a little bit about yourselves, how you got to where you are today, and then what got you involved with the Tree Council. Phil, if you want to start first.
Sure. Really nice to meet you, and thanks for inviting us. Pleasure to be here today. So I've kind of been in the conservation sector for the bulk of my career. I'm actually 50 this year.
You wouldn't know it, Phil.
And thank you. Very kind. So I've been doing this sort of work for around about 30 years.
Wow.
And again, I've worked for a range of different organisations, from the Wildlife Trust to national parks, before arriving with the Tree Council. And I've been with the Tree Council for about a year and a half now. Kind of my role within the Tree Council is head of major tree planting projects. Generally, my background is kind of around working with both people and wildlife. So I've always been involved in kind of training people within the sector, and that's something that I really enjoy. So I really like upskilling young people around conservation, caring for trees, caring for the local environment, and that's something I feel really passionate about. I kind of started at the ground level, really, when I first started in the sector, and just worked my way up over time. So I don't have a degree or anything like that. It's really just kind of, I've learned a lot on the job as I've been doing it, and done sort of various courses over the course of my career. And I'm really keen to kind of support maybe young people that wouldn't be thinking about going to university to kind of get into the conservation sector, kind of through like the sort of apprenticeship route and things like that. I think there's lots of opportunities for young people that maybe, like working with their hands, like being outside, and again, are really passionate about doing something for wildlife and conservation.
Amazing, I love that. And Annie?
Yeah, so I kind of knew I always wanted to be in nature conservation, had that kind of want to save the animals feeling when you're a teenager, but didn't quite know how to kind of go about it. So I went down the degree route, came out 4 years later with a master's in ecology and the environment, and started off doing lots of different survey work, so surveying hedgehogs, surveying wading birds in the uplands, all sorts of different kind of going out and discovering nature. But I really kind of learned that my passion wasn't just nature, but it was talking to people about it. So probably similar to yourself, Phil. I really enjoyed showing people nature. We did guided walks, and you'd go find the rare orchid and watch people's faces light up, or you spot some shorted owl flying across the moor, and people, that kind of joy that people got. So I kind of developed much more kind of a people role, went into kind of parks development side of things, park ranger service, that side of things. And now I'm at the Tree Council, been here for 18 months, and I'm the lead for hedgerows. We have a Life on the Hedge project, which I manage in the Tree Council.
Amazing. It's a great history of working alongside conservation and helping the planet. And the Tree Council is a massive part of that. So obviously last year in 2023, Tree Council celebrated its 50th anniversary, which is amazing. So tell me a little bit then about why the Tree Council was first established back in 73.
So, I mean, a big part of the formation of the Tree Council was following the Plant a Tree in 73 campaign, which really came about due to kind of the issue of Dutch elm disease that was sweeping across the UK. So Dutch elm was very prevalent in the 60s and 70s, and I'm sure a lot of people know a little bit about Dutch elm, that it decimated the majority of our English elm trees across the UK. It's kind of a fungal disease that affects the vascular systems of the elm trees and kind of clogs them. Okay. And then there's a vector, which is the elm bark beetle, that transfers the disease between the trees. So really, as a result of the loss of a lot of our historic elms, the government were very keen to see more people get involved in tree planting, and obviously good quality tree planting. And as a result of that, the Tree Council was kind of formed as a body that could really facilitate that in terms of getting more people, getting the community involved in tree planting across the UK, caring for trees as well, so caring for trees that were remaining within our landscape, and promoting good practice for trees as well. So we're very much an umbrella organisation that kind of covers the tree sector. So we have lots of different bodies that are members of the Tree Council, and we support them with guidance and good practice. And again, our main work is all around connecting people with trees, and so our kind of straplines for the love of trees is why we do it. So really, anything about trees is our area, and I think we're really keen to just kind of bring more people to trees and get more people tuned into what we're doing.
So Phil, we're seeing a decline in trees still within the UK, and we're obviously working a lot harder to try and fix that. So tell me a little bit about kind of how trees are still declining now in 2024 compared to what we just spoke about as to why the Tree Council was founded in 73.
Yeah, I think there's probably, there's quite big declines in kind of tree health and tree quality, and I think around sort of the quality of woodland management as well. So we've actually seen slight increases over the last 100 years of our tree numbers.
Yeah.
But there is obviously a big need to be planting more trees, within the current climate crisis. So again, if we're going to meet those objectives of 1.5 degrees, we need to be doing everything we can to reduce emissions and also protect the trees that we've got and increase tree cover. But it's not just about kind of carbon and greenhouse gases. Obviously, we have big issues around biodiversity and wildlife within the UK. So, sadly, we're one of the most depleted countries in terms of the quality of our habitats and wildlife, and again, 50% of our biodiversity has been lost within the UK. So
50%.
It is, it's very shocking.
So 50% biodiversity within the UK. What does that mean? Does that mean 50% of our trees are gone?
It's kind of looking at the range of species within the UK overall. So, there's a number of different threats that are impacting on not just our trees, but, our invertebrate populations, our birds. So, we've got the issues around the rising temperatures of climate that are impacting things. So obviously you've got impacts around development as well. You've got loss of habitat. So a good example is like our wildflower meadows. We're seeing massive losses of our traditional wildflower meadows within the UK that are having a big knock-on effect around all the invertebrates that would be connected to those, the mammals that would be connected to those habitats, and then the birds. So it's all about that whole chain within the bigger ecosystem.
You mentioned that alongside that, as well as preserving, the Tree Council also works to plant new trees, plant new hedgerows. Do you find any challenges or difficulties when it comes to planting those new trees, new hedgerows? Do you come up against any vandalism, any native versus non-native? Is there any changes in the climate that affect those new plants?
Yeah, so that means, do you want to come in on that one, Annie?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of things like survival rates, we can find that we'd do lots of different trials to work out the best way to make sure trees survive. So it's not just a case of pop the tree in the ground, leave it, job done, let it grow.
Of course.
It's actually making sure that tree's got the best possible start. So whether that's using a tree guard, whether it's fencing it off. Sometimes it's best to not even to keep it quiet. So when there are places like high vandalism in some of our urban areas, actually not putting a tree guard on is a good idea because it keeps it hidden and is less of a target. Some of our urban areas, we can struggle with things like dog damage, unfortunately. People kind of go in, or I've had a site where trees have been stolen once they've gone in, unfortunately. So there are kind of challenges around that side of things.
Yeah.
With changing climate, potentially more drought can be a problem. So encouraging trees to be kind of mulched, encouraging our volunteers to help look after those trees to make sure that they have that kind of best possible start as well.
Perfect. And is that your volunteers you just mentioned there? So is that your volunteer tree wardens that you use to help kind of nurture and save those new planted trees?
Yeah, so our tree wardens are an absolute fabulous network of volunteers all across the country. So we have lots of different tree warden networks. They're all linked to a local authority area. Hopefully there's one near the listeners as they speak. And these are the experts, but they're not just the local experts. They're the kind of eyes and ears on the ground. They kind of know where the best trees are in the area. They know the local conditions, what kind of what grows best in that area. And they're the kind of eyes and ears. They spot if there's going to be a planning application maybe that might be threatening some trees. And then they're also that voice for the trees as well. So our tree wardens really kind of speak up for trees. They make sure that people are valuing them, they're looking out for them. And then they do that kind of follow-up sort of trees love care, we call it, where you go back and you potentially weed or make sure that the trees have room and space to grow.
So Annie, I just want to circle back a little bit because you mentioned something there in your answer around any challenges you face with the new planted trees. And you mentioned the cages. So when I think of a newly planted tree, I always think of those little kind of, sometimes it's wire, sometimes they do a little wooden cage around the tree to help protect it. But you mentioned that sometimes it's better to just take them off because doesn't encourage people to damage the tree. I think that's absolutely insane that people are seeing a newly planted tree and thinking, I'm going to vandalize that. Is that something that you have found more effective then, like taking those boxes off?
It's definitely very sort of site specific, but yeah, I've been to sites where we've sort of trialled both, and it's been really kind of noticeable that the trees without the guards on were left and sort of overlooked, and were able to then kind of establish a bit better. And I don't think it was necessarily a kind of malicious, I'm going to go out and there's a tree, but I think it shows a real disconnect that perhaps people have, and they don't kind of necessarily connect to nature in the same way. And instead of seeing that tree as a positive thing, it's seen more as something that's come and invaded their space. So it's really important that we work with communities, that we work with those young people to plant the trees themselves, so they really feel that connection. So they're involved right from the beginning. Ideally, if they're involved from growing it from a seed, is even better. And that kind of nurture, and really kind of develop that nurture feeling, because we have lost some disconnect to nature. Within some of our urban areas have become very sparse and void of trees and greenery, and I think we're seeing that knock-on effect, that children aren't necessarily playing out in kind of fields and countryside in the same way. So we kind of go through with our National Schools programme and really kind of work with those children to kind of understand that value that nature brings. So hopefully that they then kind of understand when a tree does arrive, why it's arrived, but they're also that they've been involved in that process of the tree arriving. So instead of an authority coming along and placing trees on them, it's actually the community saying, I want those trees, and they're making the decisions for their local open spaces as well, rather than us sort of, you shall have trees. It's them saying, we want trees.
I love that. I love that nurturing aspect and getting them educated at such a nice young age, because then it's, like you say, it's going to build up that connection again to the natural world, isn't it? I love that. So we talked there a little bit about projects. So can you tell me a little bit about any projects you've got going on about establishing trees within more urban environments? So like the significance behind re-establishing or caring for trees in our urban environment, and if you've got any projects for that.
I mean, we can probably answer this between us, can't we? I think so. We do. I mean, we're very keen to fund tree planting programs within urban environments, because again, we're really interested in kind of expanding canopy cover where it might be deficient as well, and you're much more likely to find actually, your towns and your cities have got a lack of trees. And as Annie said earlier, it's all about that thing around habitat connectivity as well. So, for UK wildlife, they find it much better to have a network of trees and habitats that they can either jump between as a stepping stone to move across an area, or actually, connective hedgerows that wildlife can move between, to expand its range and expand its habitat. So that's really important for us. So we're really keen to see a lot more planting within urban communities. But it's very important to make sure that we're getting the right tree in the right location. And obviously, if you were thinking of planting maybe in a private domestic garden, small front garden, it would be great to have a tree there, but it wouldn't be appropriate necessarily to put a tree that's going to get very large at maturity. And you might want to think about, maybe could I plant a fruit tree that's going to be on a small rootstock, for example, that's going to stay to a reasonably modest size, but it's going to give me, really nice flower in the spring, let's say from a lovely flowering apple. It's going to give me some fruit for the family so that we can have something to eat from it. And then it's also going to be great for wildlife. So, apples are great pollinators, great for the birds, great for mammals, where you've got the windfall fruit. So, it's that thing of actually making sure that you're picking the right tree for the right place. Yeah,
and that right tree, right place, that's such an interesting saying, because I don't think I ever would have thought there was a wrong place to plant a tree. Like when you see a green area, I'd be thinking, oh, I could put a lovely little tree in there. But does that go back to trees that were planted kind of many years ago as well? Because you always hear people complaining about, oh, that tree blocks the light coming into my flat, conkers fall on my car, it's covered in bird poo. Does that relate then to trees that have been planted many years ago?
I mean, it can do. So, historically, you might find actually in some of our towns and cities, we might have historic avenues of trees. So, a great example is the London Plane, that we've got, beautiful avenues of London Plane that are quite majestic trees and really work, they do work quite well within our cityscapes, and they're fantastic in terms of dealing with the pollution as well. So, London Planes are really tolerant of pollution. So, it's a great tree for those circumstances, but they do get very large. So, actually, where you've got these historic avenues, it can work. But it's around, thinking which tree is right for the right location, and actually how you manage that tree as well. So it's not necessarily just the species, but how you actually manage that tree. And I think some people don't realise that. So a good example is maybe a tree like hazel. So we use hazel quite a lot, and we encourage people to plant hazel. It's a great tree for the changing climate, and it can be managed as a coppice as well. So actually, if you plant it, if it gets too big, you can actually coppice it down. And then it will regenerate from the bottom. So it's a way that you can have a tree, but you can manage the size of it. And I'm sure Annie uses hazel and plants that you can coppice very much within hedgerow planting.
Yeah, so the hedgerows, do you find that they're more popular in those urban environments then?
It can be a real kind of key thing to kind of use. If you've got an area that you want to green up, you don't necessarily maybe have the space or the sort of soil depth that you might want. Hedgerow can be really kind of useful because you can keep them, as Phil says, trimmed to the size that you want. So you can kind of keep them into quite small, contained areas. They're also really good for pollution when it comes to kind of urban pollution. So often we think about the leaves absorbing air pollution, but the main thing is really that the hedge can deflect air pollution. So if you're really smart with how you plant your hedge, you can get the air will sort of be forced upwards when it hits the hedge. And that polluted air, instead of staying at kind of breathing level on the pavements, is then forced upwards. Whereas with a tree, potentially that can trap the polluted air at that kind of breathing level. So you can be really smart with how you kind of plant in your urban areas to actually deflect pollution away rather than trap it. So it's kind of a case of being sort of smart planting, plant smarter as it were, and then you can help to kind of reduce air pollution.
That's so cool. I'd never heard of that before. You always just assume that it'll absorb it. You'd never be able to deflect it away. So moving on to focus a little bit more on hedgerows specifically. So this may sound like a really dumb question, Annie, but please let me know, what are the main differences, despite the size, between a tree and a hedgerow?
So it's definitely not a stupid question in the slightest. So we all kind of go, oh yeah, a hedge. And when we kind of know what a hedge is in our mind, but when it comes to actually describing a hedge, you find people kind of, they stop and they go, oh, I kind of know what one looks like, but I can't quite describe it. They're what we'd call a linear feature. So a hedgerow is a line of trees. So they're the same species that would potentially grow into trees. So something like a hawthorn or a hazel, for example, if you just planted that on its own in isolation, it would grow into what you typically view as a tree.
Okay.
Whereas if you plant it in a line, they then become what we would start to call a hedge. And hedges have the canopies are touching, they're kind of a continuous strip of those kind of bushy tree species, and tend to be managed as well. So that's one of the kind of key points to a hedge, is that at some point it will be cut or coppiced or laid, and we can talk about a bit more about that in a minute. But that kind of management helps to really kind of define a hedge. They sort of tend not to be any sort of wider than about 5 meters or so, and they can be as long as you want them. So often you'll find them, say, around a field boundary, around the edge of your house. So they're kind of like, linear boundary features.
In general, what other positivities do they bring to our ecosystems?
Hedges are incredible for both wildlife and both us as well. So they're technically, you'd say, like a man-made habitat. Hedges have been planted. But what they do is they mimic the ancient habitat of woodland, grassland edge.
Okay.
So if you talk to kind of ecologists, they'll always say the best bits of biodiversity, where all the rich nature is often in edges, and it's where like a woodland and a grassland meet together, where you'll have some bits that are shady, some bits that are full sunlight, some kind of open patches. And so a hedge effectively kind of mimics that. And so you get all the best bits of grassland and you get all the best bits of woodland all together in one. So you have a habitat that's kind of reflective of this kind of traditional kind of woodland edge. So it means you get kind of woodland species living in hedges, but you also get your grassland species in there as well. So a really good hedge is for wildlife is one that's really dense and thick and bushy, one that's got loads of different plants that are different sizes, different kind of structures to them, that would potentially maybe have a bank at the bottom. A really good hedge would have a nice wide margin to it, so there'd be all sorts of kind of wildflowers in there, places for amphibians to hibernate, rootways for hedgehogs, or something like a dormouse. So dormice live in trees completely, so they're reliant on things like hedges to get them from woodland to woodland, or they live in the hedge because they won't then touch the ground. It's like the floor is lava. If you're a dormouse, you'll stay in the tree. So the hedge provides a continuous stretch of woody features for things like dormice to travel through. They create kind of a buffet, as it were, for barn owls to kind of hunt along. They're that kind of solid bit of biodiversity. So often you get kind of sort of farmed landscapes, and then the kind of edges are where our hedges are. But that also is area that hasn't been farmed for hundreds of years potentially. So they're really good for carbon storage. So that's carbon storage in the soil, but it's also carbon storage within the actual hedge itself, within the kind of wooded area. So they're really good for being able to kind of lock in that carbon, because they're never going to get ploughed or kind of brought into the farming system, because they've already been allocated, as it were, as a hedge.
Is there things that we do that can damage that life cycle of a hedge that can potentially live forever?
Yeah, so our hedges are under threat, and the main kind of two reasons they're under threat are, apart from sort of development and removal, is over-management and under-management.
Oh, wow.
And it sounds very kind of contradictory that they're sort of two the opposite. So if you leave a hedge and you don't manage it at all, it'll effectively just become a line of trees, which from a carbon viewpoint, not necessarily the end of the world. It's still good for some nesting birds, but you lose the real diversity, you lose the real gem of bushiness when you do that. So you need to make sure your hedge at some point is put back into that rejuvenation cycle. So if you just leave it and don't do anything, then eventually it will just become a line of trees which will start to die off, and you'll lose your hedge. And you can see that across the countryside. You can spot where a hedge used to be, because you just have a kind of line of handful of trees in a line. But then the flip side of that is we're also losing hedges because they are cut to the same point every year too kind of rigorously.
Okay.
So the farmer uses an instrument called a flail, which comes along and kind of cuts the hedge, and hedge cutting is essential for a hedge. But if you're cutting it at the same point every year, you start to weaken the plant. And it tries its best to put on regrowth, but you're constantly cutting it back to that same part, and they start to then get gappy, they start to die off, you start to lose all that lovely growth at the bottom of your hedge as well. So we encourage farmers to either leave it and cut it every few years, let your hedge breathe, or to do what we call incremental cutting, where you just let it grow a little bit more every year. So you can still keep a nice neat shape. We like neat in our hedges. So you can keep that kind of neat shape, but every year just give it a little bit longer. And by doing so, you extend the life of the hedge, you help keep it in a good cycle. But it also creates more blossom for the next year, which is then obviously really good for our pollinators, and makes a really good kind of bushy wildlife hedge. And at some point you will have to then lay a coppice it again. It's always a cycle. So one of our kind of key messages is that hedges are always on a kind of somewhere on the management cycle. But the fabulous bit is you can always put them back into the cycle. So whatever went wrong, if you're looking at a hedge and you go, oh, this one was overmanaged or undermanaged, you can still put it back into that wonderful cycle again.
Amazing. And that's so important, I imagine. And all of that stuff that you spoke about educating the farmers on that undermanagement and that overmanagement, is that all part of your Life on the Hedge project?
Yeah, so our Life on the Hedge project, it's a lottery funded project, and it's all about kind of getting the message about hedgerows out there. So it's telling people how great they are in the first place for biodiversity, but also, talking to those landowners, working with them to work out how best to manage their hedge, where is it in the life cycle. We work really closely with the People's Trust for Endangered Species. We work with Farming Wildlife and Advisory Group, work with the National Hedge Laying Society, and they're the people that are on the ground delivering that kind of farmer engagement face-to-face, making sure that they're giving that kind of really great, useful advice, but also tying it into where farmers can get the money for it to do so. So hedge laying comes at a cost, understandably. You've got a very skilled person. There are now really good grants available. So it's making sure that those connections are made between the person with the hedge, the person with the skill, and then the person with the money as well.
Amazing. And I want to kind of move into now a little bit more about just kind of your everyday person that's wanting to plant trees, plant hedgerows. And this question comes from a little bit of a selfish place as well. So apologies, but we love trees, love plants in my house. And every single year we collect conkers to plant conkers and kind of try and grow a little conker tree, not in our garden because that'll overtake the entire thing, but just to kind of get it up from a seedling. And last year we planted 9 and we only got 1 out of it. It's doing really well this summer, but a little pesky squirrel destroyed all of those little seedlings. So not necessarily about wildlife, because I imagine that's a hard thing to control, to stop squirrels from digging them up. But what's your top pieces of advice for planters out there who may never have done it before or who are struggling like myself to get them kind of going? What's your top piece of advice to keep them nice and healthy and planted?
Anyone who's interested in growing trees from seed, if you have a look on our website, we've got a fantastic guide, the Tree Growers Guide, which is available to download, and that will give you all the tips that you need for successfully growing your own trees from seed. I mean, I'll hand over to Annie because she's doing a lot of work on this within her project, so she can tell you a little bit more.
Perfect.
Our community tree nurseries is a sort of a phrase that people hear and what quite is a community tree nursery. And it's really just people getting together and sharing that experience of growing together. So it might be someone in an allotment, it might be in a school ground, but it's local people sort of collecting the seed locally and then growing it together and kind of learning from one another. Right, let's keep it hidden perhaps. We helped create also a young tree growers guide this year. So the Tree Growers Guide itself is full of absolutely amazing facts and tips and hints and things and ways to grow your seed. Certain seeds will need stratification, so they'll need like a dormancy period. So if you think in the wild, as it were, there's frosts and things that contribute to that germination cycle. So a community tree nursery will have to kind of replicate that. So it might be that some seeds need to be kept in the fridge over winter for them to kind of feel like it's winter before they then can grow. So we took the Tree Growers Guide and created with our education team the Young Tree Growers Guide. So that gives them the real kind of simple steps and they kind of link in with school activities and put it through in a nice kind of way for children to understand as well. So definitely go and Google Tree Growers Guide and Young Tree Growers Guide for all those kind of hints and tips. But we really found that our project kind of got best kind of value when we worked with schools. So we do a lot of supporting schools to help create community tree nurseries, to link in with their local community tree nursery, because collecting hawthorn berries, if there's one of you, you can maybe collect a handful or so. If you've got a whole class of children, that's not free labour, but that's loads of little hands that can go around and collect your berries. So the children love sort of seed collecting, and it's a really good way for them to be involved right from the start. So instead of just a tree, kind of an abstract tree comes and they plant it and that's the end of that, actually growing that tree from seed really grows that connection and really grows that nurturing feeling that they can see that tiny little thing that they collected and something like a berry, they had to kind of mush it and find the seed within the berry and really kind of go hunting for it to then plant it and to have something to grow into the kind of local area. But linking them with a community tree nursery means you kind of have those local expertise that can then help the children to say, this is perhaps we need to stratify this, or we'll take it. And we've got lots of different kind of models and different things that are working. We created some willow beds this year as well with children, which was brilliant fun. So the children planted different species of willow, which will then, as they grow, can be coppiced and harvested and used for willow weaving projects. So they've got all sorts of different kind of colours of willow, and they'll be able to use their materials on site, but also share with their neighbouring schools. So they've already started kind of building up networks so they can share the willow rods that they've created.
Amazing.
And it's fascinating to see the children out there. We did some of the kind of planting sessions, and the value they get from being outside, their little faces, they're having so much fun being out of the classroom and doing something practical.
Yeah, and I imagine it brings them back to that whole connecting to nature thing that we spoke about previously as well. And I think it's such a vital project for them to get involved with. And the collecting the seeds and the nuts and stuff that we talked about, that's seed gathering, isn't it? And I think there's such a vital section on the Tree Council website that talks about seed gathering and has that educational fact to it. You've also answered why my partner puts conkers in my freezer every year. So now I know why there's conkers in my freezer.
Just to break those ones.
Yeah. So thank you so much. That seed gathering information is amazing. And I really do recommend to any of our listeners to check out that aspect, because I imagine it can be so beneficial for just members of the public to be collecting those berries and seeds and replanting those. And that will really help with our environments and our ecosystems. And we spoke a lot about all of the positive projects and the positive changes that the Tree Council are bringing in. But do you find any challenges with the projects at all? Is there any difficulties that you face or currently are facing that are hard to push through, or you have overcome and have learnt lessons from?
I think kind of nationally there's quite a few challenges around tree planting, and sadly we are seeing some schemes fail, and that's maybe down to kind of poor guidance and poor execution. So we're really keen that actually we try and provide the best possible guidance and support for the groups that we work with and the communities that we work with, and the advice for our website in terms of actually how to make sure that the trees you're planting are going to be successful and they're going to establish well, be the right tree in the right place. So I think it's that thing around, it's around information and behaviour change. And as I was saying earlier, we're a relatively small organisation, so we're just over 20 people within our organisation, around about 25. We're much smaller than some of the big organisations like the Woodland Trust and the Forestry Commission, and we're really keen to actually extend our reach and for more people to become aware of our work and understand best practice in terms of tree planting and tree care. One of the big issues with tree failures as well is around lack of water during the establishment period. So we really try and encourage local communities to think about, are there opportunities for them to get involved in actually watering trees within their local community? And this could be something as simple as a new tree planting within your local school playground, where you could go along as a parent and get the kids involved in watering during the school holidays, perhaps, or even there's been a new street tree that's been planted outside your house. Could you actually use some of your grey water, maybe some of your bath water, just to water that tree during hot weather? Because most trees fail during the early years due to a lack of irrigation, and that aftercare. So it's really important. It's not just I'm going to plant a tree, walk away and forget about it. The first 5 years of a tree's life are the most important in terms of actually nurturing and helping it to put down its roots and establish well. We're quite passionate about making sure people think about the right size of tree to plant as well, because sometimes people think I'm going to spend the biggest budget I can and get the biggest tree as I can because it's going to be the best. It's definitely not always the case. So you're much better planting a more modest small tree, because it will put down its roots quicker and establish quicker than if you put in a larger tree. So it's a bit of a false economy. And what you'll often find in lots of new developments, the developers will put in quite big statement trees because they think it will help them to sell houses. And then you might find that actually a lot of those trees fail because they were too big and their establishment requirements are too high. So always think about actually the smaller the tree, the better to put in, because it will inevitably overtake a bigger tree it was put in at the same time.
So for our listeners, do you have any quick fun tips that they can use and take on board for seed planting, tree planting, hedgerow planting, anything?
I think my top hedgerow tip would definitely be around diversity and have lots of diversity within your hedge. So one lovely story is around holly. So if you have holly in your hedge and you potentially don't kind of cut it and let it grow, that stops the witches running across the top of your hedge.
Witches?
And I love that as a top little tip. So if you can have holly in your hedge. Holly's quite a slow growing species, but it's also, again, very good for wildlife. But it's really around diversity and also letting maybe a tree grow up. So if you've got a hedge and you can choose one or two to be what we call a hedgerow tree that can stand proud and go to full canopy above that kind of hedgerow line, that makes a good hedge even better.
Amazing. Love that. So holly might take a while, but eventually it'll stop the witches in my garden.
Well worth it.
Yeah,
perfect.
We've got lots and lots of tips. So we do lots of campaigns over the year. So we have National Tree Week, National Hedgerow Week, seed growing season.
Amazing.
So if you follow the Tree Council and have a look at our campaigns, you'll get lots of different tips around tree care, hedgerow care, tree planting, seed gathering, all via our website.
Perfect.
And again, you've got opportunities to celebrate these national days within your own local community if you wanted to organise an event as well.
Amazing. And I'm conscious that we've just been talking forever and I could talk for even longer about trees. I think it's so fascinating, the aspects behind trees and hedgerows and the positivities that they provide for us. So before I let you guys go, the one thing that I want to ask from each of you is if there is one thing from our conversations today that you would want our listeners to take away, what would that one thing be?
I think for me, it would be to go out and notice.
Okay.
So maybe take a different route when you walk the dog. Maybe have a different when you're walking to the shop. Just notice those trees and those hedges around you and start to kind of maybe think about, oh, that one's got a different leaf shape to that one. That one's a bit kind of a different sort of structure, or, oh, that's interesting. They've let a hedgerow tree grow up, for example, and start having a look at hedgerow trees, or maybe notice there's a pest or a disease or something, and then kind of go in a bit further and try and find out what it might be. So my kind of takeaway to anyone listening is to say, just real take notice and talk about what you find. Go home and say, oh, I just saw this tree and it was lovely and it was in blossom, and have those conversations, because that's how we start to really kind of spread the message and build that value and that connection back to trees.
Oh, I love that. No pressure, Phil.
I think probably the key thing is kind of thinking about trees as part of bigger habitats.
Yeah.
So we're really grateful that over the last 3 years we've had the support of Animal Friends, and obviously we've achieved a lot through your support. I think we've supported just under 70 individual projects, planted just under 5,000 trees.
That's amazing.
3.5 kilometres of hedgerow. So some great achievements through the support of Animal Friends. And I think kind of one of the projects that sticks out for me is actually a project that, with your support, we provided some great habitat connectivity. So this was the Adhurst Allotments project in Petersfield. So through the support of Animal Friends, we planted a whole range of connective hedgerow on that site, and that was kind of part of a collection of different habitats. So we've got a treescape, we've got a community allotments, we've got wildflower areas, we've got a stream that runs through the site. So it was kind of using trees really just to connect in all those different habitats and provide what we call kind of a mosaic of different habitats on the site. And as a result, we really saw wildlife on the site kind of flourish. So that's one of the projects that I really enjoyed from the last couple of years, because we've got some really good wildlife populations. We've got green woodpeckers that are using the site, bats that are feeding and foraging on the hedgerows. One of the main focuses was around installing dormouse habitat. And over the last couple of years, we've seen dormice move into that site, kind of a result of some of the planting that we've done. And we have slow worms, we have stoats, we've got a whole collection of different species that are using that site because it is a broader habitat. And so I think the key thing that I try and say to your listeners is actually when you're thinking about planting a tree, think about, a ecosystem that you can create around that tree, and you're going to see much bigger wildlife benefits, and obviously the trees are going to love that as well. That if you're maybe thinking of planting, a mini orchard or some fruit trees, if you can put some pollinating wildflowers, as an understory, that may well actually shade the roots of your tree while it develops. So it's going to need less water, but it's also going to provide, those pollinators that are going to pollinate your tree and give you more fruit at the end of the day. So it's kind of think about trees in a balanced system, connected rather than in isolation. And I think that's a big part of the work of the Tree Council. It's kind of connecting habitats, connecting landscapes, and connecting people as well, connecting people with trees and getting more people tuned in, to what we're doing.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. That was so educational, and I'm sure our listeners will have got so much from that. So thank you both so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of our listeners. You can find out news about our podcast on our Instagram or TikTok handles, which is at Animal Friends Insurance, or on our Facebook page at Animal Friends Pet Insurance.